The most unsettling realization I ever recorded did not concern delusion, neurosis, or any recognizable disorder. It centered on a peculiar group of individuals whose inner vision extended far beyond ordinary awareness. People who detected subtle signals so faint that the rest of humanity overlooked them entirely. Their minds registered the flicker at the edge of someone's smile, the tremor behind polite conversation, the tension hidden beneath surface harmony. This uncanny clarity granted them access to layers of meaning most never perceive, yet the gift repeatedly crushed those who carried it. During years of observation, I found that these individuals lived in permanent conflict with their surroundings. They sensed fragile emotional undercurrents, decoded hidden motives, and spotted contradictions between speech and intention with an accuracy that puzzled even them. Strangers felt strangely transparent in their presence, as if every buried fear or concealed impulse had been dragged to light. The world expected them to behave as everyone else did, but their inner landscape operated according to rules few understood. What might appear trivial to others, an eyebrow movement, a hesitant tone, an abrupt shift in posture, became for them a revelation of psychological truth. This capacity rarely brought comfort. Instead, it produced exhaustion, loneliness, and a sense of being misplaced in society. I eventually realized this had nothing to do with fragility. Their suffering emerged because they perceived too much, too quickly, too accurately for social life to absorb. My turning point came in 1913, a turbulent season of my own life marked by spiritual upheaval and professional rupture. As I navigated the aftermath of my separation from Freud, a young woman arrived at my practice. She carried an unusual stillness, the sort that seemed to listen to everything even before a word was spoken. Her mind functioned like a finely tuned inner instrument, constantly picking up signals people unintentionally transmitted. She would pause mid-sentence as if registering information arriving from an invisible source. Her observations about others were startling not because they were imaginative, but because they were correct. She could identify hidden resentment dancing behind a courteous greeting. She could sense grief masked by humor. She could feel jealousy radiating from someone who never mentioned envy. Her impressions were not vague intuitions. They were precise psychological conclusions. And the most remarkable detail was that she never framed these impressions as mystical insights. She simply saw what others didn't. This sharpened awareness, however, tormented her. Maintaining friendships became nearly impossible. People felt exposed, even inspected, in her presence. They couldn't articulate why they felt uncomfortable, but they sensed that she noticed too much. She lost jobs because colleagues interpreted her perceptiveness as judgment. She drew hostility from individuals convinced she had criticized them when she had done nothing except exist with unusual clarity. I spent several months documenting her experiences, convinced that I was studying something rarely discussed in psychology. Her case did not resemble hallucination, mania, or distortion of reality. Instead, she displayed what I later termed differentiated perception, an enhanced intuitive mechanism that gathered unconscious material from others with astonishing ease. She noticed not only external cues but the emotional atmosphere filling entire rooms. I filled pages with notes about her abilities. The patient perceives unconscious contents in others with extraordinary precision, yet this endowment overwhelms her rather than guiding her. Normal interaction becomes nearly impossible because she cannot ignore what others suppress. Her challenges revealed a truth I had only partially explored. The unconscious is not silent. It communicates through hesitation, stiffness, forced laughter, restless hands, and countless invisible channels. Most people filter these signals to protect themselves. This patient had no such filter. Her inner openness absorbed everything. As I investigated further, I recognized a phenomenon that would later become crucial to my theory: participation mystique. This term described a state of heightened sensitivity in which boundaries between one's inner world and the unconscious currents around it become permeable. Individuals with this orientation don't merely perceive emotional climates, they merge with them. I realized that the patient's struggles were not due to weakness but due to the absence of an internal barrier strong enough to protect her individuality. Her condition mirrored a characteristic I had already identified within my typology: the introverted intuitive orientation. People with this configuration belong to a minority with unusual perceptive depth. They detect underlying dynamics long before they manifest openly. Their minds gather insights from scattered hints, assembling them into coherent psychological narratives that others only understand in retrospect. I noted that these individuals don't simply notice obvious expressions. They sense the tension behind controlled composure. They feel the despair behind determined ambition. They intuit the motives that shape relationships before the relationships themselves take form. They respond to what others have not yet admitted to themselves. But this ability carries immense weight. It disrupts implicit agreements that hold communities together. Groups function through shared illusions and unspoken compromises. When someone perceives what the group chooses not to acknowledge, the group subconsciously identifies that person as a threat. The highly perceptive individual unintentionally destabilizes the atmosphere around them simply by recognizing what others avoid. I found myself writing repeatedly, "The danger lies not in clarity but in the distance it creates." These individuals become social mirrors reflecting truths the world resists. People often react not with curiosity but with defensiveness. They project their own disowned qualities onto the person who perceives too clearly. Over time, I noticed a pattern. When the patient voiced concerns gently, others accused her of negativity. When she attempted to help, people charged her with inventing problems. When she sensed tension and tried to ease it, individuals responded with hostility. They interpreted her insight as intrusion, even though she had no intention of dissecting anyone. She simply couldn't avoid noticing. I eventually recognized that this dynamic did not reflect her character. It reflected a universal psychological mechanism: projection of the shadow. Human beings often attack the person who reveals what they cannot bear to acknowledge internally. The bearer of clear vision becomes a target for unconscious fear. The woman who sat in my office in 1913 illustrated this principle perfectly. She was not confrontational, arrogant, or accusatory. Yet she repeatedly became the scapegoat wherever she went. People assumed she generated conflict when in reality she perceived conflict before it erupted. She became the repository for what groups refused to see about themselves. Her case, however, revealed another crucial truth. Not all individuals with heightened perception experience it in the same way. Some feel others' emotions in their bodies as if they were their own. Others foresee behavioral outcomes through pattern recognition. Others sense physical manifestations of psychological distress long before symptoms emerge. Some receive torrents of impressions but cannot articulate them with coherence, leaving them overwhelmed by information without structure. This realization forced me to re-evaluate my understanding of intuition. It was not a single function but a family of related processes, each carrying distinct difficulties and distinct forms of insight. That patient's presence in my life emerged at a moment when I myself was confronting an inner flood of symbolic imagery, dreams, and visions. While guiding her, I began to understand my own internal storms with more clarity. Her ability illuminated aspects of my own psyche, helping me articulate principles I had long suspected but never fully grasped. She eventually became the foundation of my most troubling recognition. When the unconscious becomes too visible, the individual risks losing their psychological foothold. Clarity without structure becomes chaos. Perception without integration becomes torment. Her story was not a tragedy, however. It became the beginning of a new understanding, one that reframed extraordinary perception not as a defect, but as an advanced psychological function demanding conscious development. Her presence forced me to confront a realization I had resisted for years. An individual gifted with unusually refined perception is not navigating the same psychological landscape as the rest of society. Their reality contains layers most people never access, and without guidance this difference becomes a source of profound alienation. While studying her reactions in various social environments, I began documenting how deeply she absorbed other people's moods. A stranger's bitterness lingered in her body hours after the encounter. Someone's hidden shame triggered in her an unexplained heaviness. A colleague's unspoken grief struck her like an unseen weight. She walked through life collecting emotional fragments that did not belong to her. This immersion in others' inner storms made everyday tasks feel monumental. Even a brief social gathering overwhelmed her, not because she lacked resilience, but because she processed atmospheric information at a scale few could imagine. Being near conflict felt to her like standing inside an erupting furnace. Being near deception felt like standing in contaminated air. Being near sorrow felt like entering an ocean of pressure. Her nervous system interpreted subtle emotional disruptions the same way a sensitive instrument detects faint disturbances in the environment. I noticed that she rarely spoke about these experiences spontaneously. She feared appearing dramatic, irrational, or intrusive. Instead, she carried these impressions silently, hoping they would fade. But they accumulated until she could no longer tell where her own emotional life ended and someone else's began. At times she asked me, "How do I know what belongs to me?" Her question captured the essence of her struggle. Without clear boundaries, she became a vessel for everyone else's unspoken burdens. Her condition mirrored a phenomenon I had been encountering with increasing frequency. Individuals whose intuitive faculties operated with such intensity that they processed psychological reality with a precision others reserve for physical reality. These individuals were not merely empathic. They perceived unconscious motivations with the same clarity someone might observe a gesture or hear a tone of voice. And yet, because these insights surfaced without conscious deliberation, they lacked the tools to interpret their impressions responsibly. As I studied her more closely, I noticed the pattern repeating across other cases. Some patients predicted relational upheavals months before anyone else recognized the warning signs. Others identified suppressed emotions in their families with uncanny accuracy. A few sensed illnesses long before symptoms surfaced. Their minds absorbed incoming signals, processed them instantly, and produced conclusions that later proved correct. Yet they doubted themselves because no one around them validated their perceptions. The wider world often dismissed such insight as imagination, overthinking, or emotional hyperreactivity. But the consistency of these observations revealed something far deeper at work. Their intuitive clarity was not a distortion. It was a sophisticated form of unconscious pattern recognition, drawing from subtle cues most people ignore. They stitched together faint signals into coherent understanding, but because they lacked a framework for this process, they felt ashamed of their clarity instead of empowered by it. I wrote repeatedly in my journals, "The burden does not arise from the vision itself, but from the isolation created by vision no one else shares." The patient from 1913 embodied this truth perfectly. She was not confused about others. She was confused about why she perceived what they denied. Her insight also revealed a second danger. Individuals with unusually refined perception often become magnets for projection. When someone confronted by them sensed that their insecurities had been seen, they reacted with hostility, attributing malicious intent to the perceptive individual. This dynamic unfolded repeatedly in my patient's life. People accused her of judging them even when she offered nothing but silence. They reacted as if she represented an internal critic they had long avoided. She became the embodiment of what they refused to acknowledge in themselves. This collective reaction shaped her sense of identity. After years of being blamed for reactions she never caused, she began assuming that something was inherently wrong with her. She apologized constantly for the discomfort she triggered in others, believing she had committed a social misstep, when in truth people were responding to the reflection of their own unresolved material. The tragedy was not that she saw too much. The tragedy was that no one had taught her how to carry what she saw. Perception without grounding becomes psychological quicksand. To help her regain her footing, I guided her through exercises designed to separate her authentic emotions from those she absorbed. Each day, I asked her to spend a period alone, away from all human influence, noting which sensations remained after solitude. What persisted belonged to her. What evaporated belonged to others. This simple practice became an anchor that preserved her sense of self. As her clarity sharpened, she gained language for describing her inner experiences. She stopped dismissing her insights. She began recognizing that she had not invented her impressions. They had always been accurate, simply unwelcome to those around her. This recognition strengthened her internal boundaries. She no longer assumed responsibility for emotional storms that originated in other people's unconscious lives. Throughout this process, I found myself transforming as well. Her case illuminated principles that had eluded me. While helping her articulate the difference between her intuition and her identity, I confronted the same challenge within myself. Her struggle mirrored my internal conflict during my confrontation with the unconscious. I too was drowning in symbolic material at that time, uncertain whether it signaled madness or transformation. By studying her, I found language for my own chaos. She demonstrated that perception without integration is torment, yet perception with integration becomes guidance. Her evolution during our sessions showed that extraordinary awareness could become either destructive or constructive depending on how consciously one relates to it. The gift does not change. Only the relationship to the gift changes. Her journey also revealed something else. Individuals with advanced perception serve as early detectors of collective psychological shifts. They sense developments long before they become visible. They experience tension long before conflict erupts. They feel imbalance long before collapse occurs. Their sensitivity is not random. It reflects their role as psychological sentinels. Yet without conscious development, this role becomes unbearable. What should be insight becomes suffering. What should be contribution becomes isolation. What should be wisdom becomes chaos. Her story taught me that those who perceive deeply require not suppression but refinement. They need boundaries, not blindness. They need understanding, not dismissal. They need integration, not avoidance. And once this occurs, perception no longer destroys them. It strengthens them. Their clarity becomes navigation, not burden. As my work with individuals possessing heightened perception expanded, a pattern emerged with striking consistency. Those who carried exceptional intuitive depth were never destroyed by their insight alone. What unraveled them was the absence of inner architecture strong enough to hold what they perceived. When perception grows faster than identity, the individual becomes vulnerable to psychological collapse. When identity grows alongside perception, the same insight becomes transformative. The patient who arrived in 1913 illustrated this truth in profound ways. Over time, she began noticing that her sensitivity no longer consumed her in the same way. The emotions she once absorbed unconsciously no longer dominated her inner life. She could walk into a charged environment and distinguish between her own internal reactions and those belonging to others. Her intuition remained sharp, but now it served as guidance rather than weight. This shift occurred gradually, through disciplined inward attention. She learned that clarity required solitude, not isolation, boundaries, not withdrawal. She discovered that perception must be grounded in a stable center, or it becomes a storm without anchor. Her transformation demonstrated that superior perception is not inherently destructive. It becomes destructive only when unaccompanied by conscious integration. Her progress emphasized another crucial truth. Individuals who perceive at advanced levels cannot rely on ordinary relational dynamics. They require connections capable of holding complexity without collapsing into defensiveness. In her case, the moment she stopped blaming herself or others' reactions, she stopped seeking validation from people whose psychological frameworks were incompatible with her own. She gravitated toward those who valued nuance, who questioned themselves honestly, who welcomed psychological insight rather than fleeing from it. As she surrounded herself with individuals who could tolerate depth, her life shifted dramatically. She discovered work that allowed her to use her clarity constructively, guiding others through emotional turmoil with remarkable steadiness. What once had overwhelmed her now served as an instrument of understanding. She began contributing insight rather than drowning in it. Her story taught me that extraordinary perception cannot be extinguished, suppressed, or ignored. Attempts to silence it only increase suffering. Instead, it must be shaped. It must be guided. It must be placed in service of conscious development rather than left to run wild in the unconscious. When individuals learn to harness such perception without identifying with it, they gain access to a way of knowing that expands human understanding. Throughout my career, I observed that individuals with refined perception often emerge during periods when collective consciousness approaches important transitions. They sense psychological tensions that societies have not yet confronted. They feel ruptures forming long before they manifest openly. Their internal turbulence mirrors what the culture has not yet admitted. This makes their lives difficult, but it also reveals their role. They carry the early signals of psychological evolution. These individuals do not choose this role. They inherit it. Their responsibility is not to rescue the world, but to develop themselves so fully that their presence becomes clarifying rather than destabilizing. When they accomplish this, they function as guides for collective awareness. When they fail, their own insight turns against them. The woman who came to me during my own crisis helped illuminate precisely this distinction. As she integrated her abilities, her presence changed. She no longer felt threatened by what she saw, and others no longer felt threatened by her clarity. She stopped absorbing pain that was not hers. She stopped apologizing for truths she never verbalized. She stopped shrinking herself to protect people who feared transparency. What remained was a person who perceived deeply, spoke carefully, and navigated psychological terrain with grounded steadiness. Her transformation showed that the challenge is never the sight itself, but the lack of consciousness guiding it. Those who perceive what others overlook are not flawed. They are ahead. They sense psychological structures that many will only recognize years later. Their lives become easier, not when they dim their insight, but when they learn to use it wisely. What once isolated them eventually becomes the very thing that offers direction to others. The danger lies not in seeing too much. The danger lies in seeing without the inner capacity to hold what is revealed. Integration turns turmoil into strength. Awareness turns confusion into precision. Consciousness turns burden into contribution. Those who see what others cannot are not misfits. They are the early architects of psychological development, preparing the human mind for realities it has not yet learned to acknowledge. Their clarity is not an error. It is an evolutionary signal waiting for conscious expression. If this exploration brought you insight, remember to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share your thoughts or experiences related to the theme. Your reflection adds depth to the conversation.